What is going on, everybody, and welcome back to another episode of Chop It Up. Before we get going into today's episode, I want to be sure to just take a minute and tell you guys to subscribe to our YouTube and Spotify channels, as that is where our main episodes are going up. So that is YouTube and Spotify for our major episodes. And if you're someone who is busy throughout the week, has a lot going on, school, job, significant other, whatever it is, you're out of town for the weekend, go check us out on Instagram and TikTok. We're posting clips of our full episodes up on there. We're posting memes. We're posting polls of who do you think is going to win over the weekend. We've got a lot of good stuff over there, so be sure to check us out on Instagram and TikTok. And then, like I said, Spotify and YouTube for the full episodes. Really anywhere on social media, we're there. So be sure to go check us out. Give us a like, subscribe, tell a friend about it as we try to grow our platform here of big-time sport fans on the Chop It Up platform. We got a lot to get into today. We got two major games that I want to talk about, and then as the college football season winds down, I want to give you guys my top 12 where I see teams kind of starting to file in at this point in the season as we only have 2 weeks left remaining in the regular season. It's always unfortunate how fast football season flies by. We wait so long for it to get here, and then as soon as it gets here, it's just gone in the wind. So without further ado, let's get into it. First game up on the deck, we have Georgia and Tennessee. Georgia picking up the big win at home against the Volunteers, bouncing back from last week's loss against Ole Miss. This was the Georgia team that everyone has been expecting to see all year long. Carson Beck really showed his resiliency and his toughness in this game. 25 of 40, 347 yards, 2 touchdowns, didn't turn the ball over a lot, or at all for that matter. He looked really clean in this game, and I think this is really the Carson Beck that we've been expecting to see all year with this Georgia team. He's had his ups and downs. He hasn't looked great. He's tried to force a lot of passes. But coming into this year, this was a guy that a lot of people thought was going to be a top 10 pick, a first-round pick at worst. And he just really hasn't turned out that way. I think right now Mel Kiper has him about in the second or third round in his mock draft. We'll see if that ends up being the case or not. But I had a feeling coming into this game, Georgia's back's against the wall. Everyone's kind of starting to count them out. And this just goes to show the type of coach that Kirby Smart is. When his team has to win a game. Did they need to win the Ole Miss game? Yeah, it would have been great if they did, but they didn't have to win this game. This Tennessee game was a must-win if they wanted to keep their college football playoff hopes alive, and they did that. When you look at this game, Georgia really was in control for, I would say, a majority of the game, maybe 3 out of the 4 quarters. And their defense stepped up when they needed to. They made plays. In the first quarter, it was a little rough. Nico Imaliava and Josh Heupel's offense was able to march the ball down the field a couple of times. But after that, they were able to make adjustments. Kirby got his guys where they needed to be, and he just out-coached Josh Heupel, it looked like, especially in the second half of this game. It was all Georgia. This Bulldogs defense was elite. And then obviously on the offensive end, when you're able to take care of the ball and not turn it over, that's going to help you win games. And now, did they light up the scoreboard in the first half? No. They were only up, they were down 3 actually going into half. But then to show the resiliency to bounce back and the toughness to respond in that second half really just goes to show that Georgia is an elite team. I know they have the loss to Ole Miss and the loss to Alabama, which they just can never seem to beat. But I think they're legit, and especially when you go to Athens and you have to play them at home, that is an almost impossible environment to win a game. So all credit goes to Georgia here. Breaking down this game a little bit, like I said, this was just a classic Georgia game. They're going to wear you out defensively. They're going to throw different looks. They're going to bring pressure. And on the offensive end, they're going to spread the ball around. They don't have the same caliber weapons that we've seen in years past, like Brock Bowers, who's now in the NFL. But they have a lot of guys that have the potential to be really good or of the caliber of Brock Bowers. They're just not quite there yet. And to me, watching Georgia in this game, it kind of seemed almost like they were a boa constrictor. At the beginning of the game, Tennessee has a lot of life. They're energetic. They're moving the ball down the field. But then as the game progresses, they have to punt. They turn the ball over. They had 3 punts in a row in the second half and then a fumble to end the game. So as the second half kind of pushes on, you see the opportunity of victory for Tennessee slowly just start to fade away, just like a boa constrictor, obviously killing its prey, just kind of slowly start to take the life out of it. And I think this is what Georgia has to do, especially if their offense isn't always clicking. The defense has to be elite, which it was against Tennessee. It wasn't against Ole Miss. That's why they lost that game. And then also, Carson Beck played clean football. He doesn't need to play outstanding. He doesn't have to throw for 400 yards and 5 touchdowns like a Cam Ward does. He just has to play clean football, trust his weapons, and Georgia's going to be okay. And ultimately, that's what ended up happening. Georgia gets the win. They put themselves in the playoff picture. And ultimately, I think we are going to see the Bulldogs make some noise in this top 12, regardless of if they win the SEC or not. Second game on deck, and really our last game we're going to talk about. BYU falls to Kansas at home in Utah. Not a great look for the Cougars. They still have control of their own destiny in terms of the Big 12. But I think this game proved a lot of people right, including myself. Last week, when you look at BYU, they got bailed out against Utah by a couple bad calls at the late part of the game, and they sneak out of Salt Lake City with a massive W. And looking at this week, I thought, okay, BYU is going to play clean football. They understand that they got pretty lucky last week. I think they're going to clean things up. They're going to be able to move the ball downfield, especially at home. I expected them to be a lot better than what they were. And I could not have been more wrong. And so sometimes you just got to take your losses, and I'm going to take my loss on this, especially looking at my predictions this week. I don't know if you guys saw that or not on our Instagram, but we took about all the losses that we could have. We went 2 for 5 on our picks for the week. So just not great out of there, out of old Chop It Up Sports. But regardless, we keep it moving. So let's look at BYU here for a minute. I think this is the worst game that BYU's probably played offensively all year. Jake Retzlaff, also known as the BY which I think is a great nickname, regardless of what religion you are or anything. I just think that's an awesome name. 192 yards, had a touchdown, and then he had an interception. So you look at that and you go, okay, not necessarily terrible, but when you look at that interception that he had, that came in the end zone at the very end of the first half. And then when you look at the course of the game throughout the second half, both teams really struggling to find points. And that interception really could have been the difference maker. If they settle for a field goal there, even if they don't get in the end zone, that still makes it a one-possession game, and then say things play out the way they did. Rather than having to go for it on 4th and long in the red zone, BYU is able to kick a field goal, maybe a game-winning field goal to win the game like we saw the week before with Utah. But that just was not the case, so they turned that ball over before halftime. And then the second half, this was really a slugfest between both teams. Jalen Daniels, Kansas's quarterback, had some bad interceptions and just some plays that I didn't really like. He just trying to do a little too much at times, whether it was on the legs or through the air. He just wasn't great. But the difference maker in this game to me was the weird fake, 4th down conversion, punt, whatever you want to call it, the pooch kick from Jalen Daniels that looks like it's going to pin BYU inside the 5-yard line. But as the BYU defender is covering the covering the gunner on the punt, it bounces off his helmet and falls within the 5-yard line. Kansas is able to jump on that and ultimately put it in the end zone on the ensuing possession. And so, yes, that's a freak play. That's a freak possession. But if you're BYU, you just can't allow mental errors like that to happen. You have to be prepared to see things like a pooch kick or trick plays, especially when you're undefeated going against a team who has nothing to lose like Kansas. They only had 3 wins on the year before this game. And so you have to be able to expect things like that. And I really feel like that play, catching BYU off guard, just kind of showed that Kansas was willing to do whatever it took to get out of there with a win. And BYU just really wasn't ready. They were stagnant. They were sloppy on both sides of the ball. And then at the end of the game, obviously BYU had a chance to, make a push and get it in the end zone before the end of the game. Just a couple plays here that I don't really understand. Setting the scene, it's 4th and 6 at around the 20-yard line for BYU at the Kansas 20, so they're getting ready to put it in the end zone. You get a false start before the play, so that backs it up to 4th and 11. And as an offensive line, as an offensive coordinator, whatever the case is, you just can't have a mental error in that situation. I know that's going to be something that's talked about in the film room and in meetings this week for the Cougars. But when you have an opportunity on 4th and short, it allows you to open up your playbook and do a lot of different things. You could try to sneak in a run. You can get it to the outside. You have guys that could run crossing routes, whatever the case is. But when you get a false start, that backs you up and that really limits what you can do offensively. And so if you're BYU, you just can't afford to have a mistake like that. There's no other way to put it. You have to be mentally sharp with the game on the line, and they weren't. And so that puts them in 4th and 11 situation. And then the play that they ran here, I also didn't really understand. You need 11 yards in order to keep your hopes alive. And you throw an 8-yard curl route, just kind of middle, find the zone type of play. It didn't really make much sense to me. As soon as that ball was caught, it didn't look like the receiver really had an opportunity to make a move upfield. And they brought him down short, obviously the first down marker. And Kansas gets out of there with the win over the Cougars, which, like I said earlier, I don't think BYU is a team that a ton of people were like, oh, watch out for BYU. But when you're undefeated and you've shown that you can win close games, I think you do have to get the respect of people. But when you get when you get a game at home against a team that is not going to make a bowl game this season and you lose it in relatively ugly fashion, obviously that's not going to help you out with any favors when it comes to the committee, when it comes to how the nation views you as a whole. And then coming down this stretch for BYU, they turn around and play an ASU squad that just rolled Kansas State at Kansas State. So it'll be interesting to see what the Cougars do from here. I don't think they're a true contender. However, they can win their conference. They still control their own destiny in that aspect, and they can still get a first-round bye despite this ugly loss that they just suffered at home. So those are the two big games of the week. There wasn't a ton of top 10 matchups like we're going to see here next week, but nevertheless, still some important games for sure. The second half of this video, I wanted to show you guys my top 12 and just kind of see how I rate these teams in the top 12, where I think they land. This is going to be a little bit of a combination between how I view these teams and then also how I expect the committee to view these teams. So it's going to be a little bit of what I think, but also what is expected of what the committee is going to do with these 12 teams coming on Tuesday night when they release those rankings. So let's get into it. At number 12, I still have Boise State. They've been consistent. I know they just had a scare against San Jose State on Saturday night on the road, but they've been able to win these close games, and they can show that, when things get tough, they can pull away. Ashton Genty, it does look like his Heisman odds have slipped up a little bit, but I still think he's easily the best running back in college football. And you could even make the argument that Boise State is fighting for the 4 seed right now. Now, hear me out. If you're not a diehard Broncos fan and you haven't really been following this pursuit that Boise State could get the 4 seed and potentially a first-round bye, let me just lay the groundwork for you. BYU, who I just talked about, has 1 loss, and Boise State also has 1 loss to Oregon. When you weigh those losses, Boise's loss to number 1 ranked Oregon is going to look a lot better than BYU's loss to unranked 4-win Kansas. Now, if BYU's to win out and Boise State wins out, there's an opportunity that the committee can look at that and say, Boise State's been consistent, they have the better loss, we're going to give them a first-round bye, and just like that, the Broncos have a first-round bye in the college football playoff. The second opportunity for this to happen is if a 2-loss Big 12 team wins the conference championship, whether that's Arizona State or Colorado. Those are the teams that it looks like could win the Big 12 with 2 losses. At that point, Boise not only has the advantage with having the better loss, but they also have only 1 loss compared to the Big 12 champ that would have 2 losses. So there's multiple opportunities for Boise State to get a bye here. I think they're in the driver's seat. I think they are going to win the Mountain West Championship, and potentially get that bye. It really all depends on how the Big 12 shakes out. And then unless something crazy in the ACC happens as well, I think we could see Boise State getting that bye. So just watch out for the Broncos. That's all I'm saying. Number 11, I have the Tennessee Volunteers. Following this loss to Georgia, I don't think they looked great. However, I think they are better than all the teams that are behind them. Whether that's Texas A&M or SMU, maybe even Clemson. I just don't think those teams are that great, in my opinion. Tennessee has the big win over Alabama that we talked about a little bit earlier. Obviously, that loss to Georgia doesn't do them any favors, and then the loss to Arkansas earlier in the year isn't going to look great. However, I just think that when you look at the gauntlet that they've had to go through in their SEC schedule, Georgia and Alabama, and they still have a couple big games remaining, it's tough to win. No one's going to go undefeated in the SEC this year for the first time in a while. And so I think when you look at Tennessee's schedule, yes, the Arkansas loss is bad. But the Georgia loss at home, at Georgia, I don't really see a lot of teams that can go into Athens and win a game in between the hedges, especially at night. I think you'd be hard-pressed to find a team in the country that squeaks out a W in that situation. So I think I still give the Vols some credit here. I think they can still be a playoff team. They don't really control their own destiny at this point, but I definitely still think they're a playoff team, so I have them at number 11. At number 10, I have the Notre Dame Fighting Irish. Now, I know what a lot of you guys are thinking. Why is Notre Dame dropping back? They've been in the 7th to 8th spot the last couple weeks. What have they done to drop back? Well, here's the answer. They've done nothing, and that's why I'm moving them back. I'm historically not a big Notre Dame guy. I know they've had years where they have been true contenders, but then they get exposed pretty quickly if they are to make it into the playoff. Their schedule this year has been pretty pathetic, and then they have the terrible loss to Northern Illinois. And I just think if you really want to consider yourself a true playoff contender, first of all, you have to play ranked teams, which Notre Dame really hasn't, with the exclusion of Louisville, who's kind of been up and down this season. And then you also can't lose to essentially FCS opponents. Northern Illinois has been mediocre this year in the MAC. And so for them to go in to South Bend and win that game, I know it was early in the year. I know it was in like week 2 or 3. But regardless, that's just unacceptable. You can't lose games like that if you truly think that you're going to be a college football contender. Now, Notre Dame hosts Army next week. Army's a team that's looking to get that Group of 5 bid. We'll see how the Fighting Irish compare to Army and their unique offense. I think Notre Dame probably wins this game, especially due to the fact that they're at home. But we've seen Notre Dame already lose at home to way lesser opponents than the Black Knights, Golden Knights, whatever Army is. I think that Notre Dame's going to win this game. However, I just don't think that they're better than a lot of these SEC teams and Big Ten teams that we're going to get into here in a second. So give me Notre Dame at the 10 spot. Number 9, I have Georgia. Now, I know it wasn't a drastic jump from 11 to 9. I get it that it was a big win. But when we get into the rest of these teams, you're going to see that you can't really necessarily put the Bulldogs in front of the 2 teams that beat them. I have Ole Miss and Bama following Georgia. I think Georgia is going to be a team that when they get into this playoff, I'm going to say win because I do think with that win over Tennessee that they are almost a lock to get into the playoff. I think that they're going to be a team that no one wants to see, whether they get the bye or not, whether they have to go on the road or it's a neutral site game. No one wants to see a Kirby Smart coach team in the playoff, maybe unless you're Alabama. But I just think Georgia is dangerous. I know Carson Beck hasn't been great. The defense, has been up and down this season. But I think at the right time, when you get into mid to late December and early January, I don't think anyone is jumping at the bit to play a Georgia Bulldogs team that has showed that when adversity hits, they can win the big game, they can clean things up, and ultimately I still think they're a national championship contender, so give me Georgia at number 9. At number 8, I have the Ole Miss Running Rebels. I keep them above Georgia simply because of the fact that they beat them and they both have 2 losses. Now, when you look at their losses to Kentucky and LSU, really not as great of losses as Georgia might have, but I just think that they have the momentum. They just beat Georgia, who now looks really good, and so I think you have to give them a little benefit of the doubt here. It just kind of makes sense, right? If Ole Miss beats Georgia and they both have 2 losses, they're both playing good ball right now. I keep Ole Miss at 8. They don't really have anyone that I think is going to test them at the end of the season. So I think Ole Miss is in a good spot to really just chill. They can win out. I don't think they're going to get tested here. So give me the Running Rebels at number 8. Hotty toddy. Number 7, I have Bama. Really weird that Alabama is back in my top 7 or just top 10 in general because 2 or 3 weeks ago, after the Tennessee loss, I was talking about how this team doesn't have what it takes to be a playoff caliber team. Jalen Milroe can't find his weapons. The defense can't get stops when they needed to. Kalen DeBoer kind of coaching in an undisciplined manner, which really is uncharacteristic of who he is. But man, since that Tennessee loss, this team has found their swagger. Jalen Milroe has been a problem, especially on his legs. He ran it all over LSU in Death Valley 2 weeks ago. Kalen DeBoer's shown that he can win big-time games. He can be resilient, which is something that a lot of people had questions with him when he was at Washington. I think as this Bama team moves forward, there will be question marks whether they get into the SEC championship or not about can they win the big game. If they get matched up with Georgia again, can they find a way to beat them? We know how hard it is to beat a team twice. Can they find a way to beat the Bulldogs? If they get matched up with Tennessee again, can they find a way to limit Nico Iamaleava and Josh Heupel's offense? It really felt like last time those 2 teams matched up, Josh Heupel just had the advantage over DeBoer. Can Kalen make those adjustments to outcoach Heupel if they were to rematch again? Similar to Georgia, if you're a playoff team and you're a conference champ, whether that's Oregon, whether you're Texas, whether it's Indiana even, maybe even BYU, I don't think you're chomping at the bit to get a first-round bye and then get matched up with Alabama in your first playoff game. I just think that's a bad move. That's a dangerous spot to be if you're a team that gets that conference championship and gets that bye and you have the Tide coming in to play you. I think that's dangerous. I think that they can win big games when they need to. Now, have they shown that they can play disciplined football in big-time situations? Yes. When you look at the LSU game, a lot of people doubted Alabama specifically just because of how hard it is to win a game at Death Valley at night. Brian Kelly, he was undefeated in Death Valley at night. There was this whole idea that because it was going to be dark outside and that LSU was going to be at home, they were going to roll Alabama. Alabama came in there, they kept their composure, and they beat the crap out of LSU. And I think that shows just how dangerous they are. So as Alabama continues to wrap up their schedule, I think they will win out as well. Not really any too tough games. Look them to make a move. Don't be surprised if they're in the SEC championship game. and you can just never count out Alabama, whether Saban's there, whether DeBoer's there. I mean, if Mickey Mouse is the head coach, you still got to watch out for Alabama. You just never know what they're going to bring to the table. So I got Bama at 7. Right in front of them at number 6, I have Miami. I'm not a big Miami guy, I'm going to be honest. For those of you that have listened to this show, you know how much I really just despise the ACC and how much lack of talent I think they have. But out of all these teams, Miami, they have 1 loss compared to all the teams that we've talked about prior. They have 2 losses besides Notre Dame and Boise State. Miami just has that bad loss to Georgia Tech, and it was pretty uncharacteristic of them. They just didn't put up the points that they normally do. Cam Ward didn't have a bad game. He just didn't have the same explosiveness that we usually see. I think some of that credit does go to Georgia Tech, but I also think, when your offense is that explosive, you're due to have a couple trip-up games here and there. Now, this offense of Miami, I think this is what's going to have to win them games. When they get matched up in this playoff, whether it's a Penn State or an Ole Miss, their defense, I don't think you can really rely on them. I know Mario Cristobal is trying to build this defensive line and this linebacker core through the portal and through a strong recruiting class. They're just not there yet, so all that pressure is really going to fall on Cam Ward and the Miami offense to keep things moving. Now, do I think they could get into a shootout with Oregon or Ole Miss and get out and pull out a win? Absolutely. I think they're totally capable of that. I just don't know if I trust them down the stretch. I do think they're going to win the ACC. I know SMU's kind of been making a push. I just don't know if the Mustangs have enough of what it takes to knock off Miami's explosiveness. And so I just think Miami's in this weird spot where they're probably better than a couple of these latter half SEC teams, but do I think they're on the same level as an Oregon or an Ohio State or a Texas? Definitely not. So I have them at number 6. At number 5, I have Penn State, kind of similar to Miami, just in a weird spot, kind of hanging out. Haven't been really tested. They lost the only test they had, and that was to Ohio State a couple weeks back. And Drew Aller, when you look at the Penn State offense, he's been okay. I think he's just a kind of middle-of-the-road quarterback. You're not going to get anything special out of Drew Aller. He can make the plays when he needs to. He has a decent arm. He's showcased that talent a lot this year. He's definitely taken a step up. However, Penn State and big games don't really go well together. We've talked about it on this show before. When it comes down to the nitty-gritty, or really the nitty-gritty, get it? Because they're a nitty line? Okay, bad joke. When you look at this Penn State team and it comes down for them to win a big game, I just don't know if anyone trusts them to do that. I like James Franklin. I think he's a really good coach. I just don't know if he's a national championship level coach. As he's showcased in the years past, whether it's a Michigan or Ohio State, he struggles to beat those teams when they're ranked inside the top 5. And so when you get into this playoff, if Penn State can stay put at number 5, say Boise State comes to Happy Valley, do I think Penn State could win that game? Absolutely. Do I think it's a guarantee? Probably not. Boise State's a really good team. Whoever gets that group of 5 spot is going to be a really good team, whether that's an Army or a team like Tulane sneaks in there. So I think Penn State's going to be tested. I think that if they stay at this 5 spot, which I kind of think they will, that this group of 5 team that's going to be coming into town is going to give them a run for their money. And it's really going to show us whether or not Penn State can be resilient and win a big game when the stakes are at their highest. So I have Penn State at 5 right now, and they also don't really have any tough games to close out their schedule. Number 4, I have the Indiana Hoosiers. I know the College Football Playoff Committee had Penn State above Indiana. That doesn't really make any sense to me. I'm getting pretty tired of the argument that Indiana hasn't played anyone, especially when they just continue to smack every team they've played. When you look at Indiana, have they played a ton of ranked teams or, competitive opponents? No. But they've done exactly what they're supposed to do against those teams. They've won every game by double digits, 2 touchdowns or more. Frank Cignetti, a guy that I'm a big fan of, he's turned this entire program around. And, do they have the same strength of schedule as Penn State? No. But they're both going to play Ohio State. And then outside of that, it's a bunch of teams that are kind of mediocre, middle of the conference, not great. So if Indiana can come in to the shoe next weekend and keep it close with keep it close with Ohio State, I think that proves that they can be a top 5 team. Now, if they go in and win this game, I think you have to make an argument that they're the favorite to win the Big Ten and potentially the number 1 seed. Because Ohio State, as we know, not an easy team to play when they're at home, at the shoe. That's going to be a rocking environment next Saturday at Big Noon Kickoff. And so if they can go in there and win that game, that is a major boost on their strength of schedule, especially if they can get the dub. I think Indiana's legit. And the reason I have them in front of these teams like Penn State and Miami is because you have to honor that undefeated record. Even if they haven't played anyone, are they just supposed to lose to teams because they're not that good? No, they're supposed to beat the brakes off of them, and that's exactly what they've done. So give me the Hoosiers at number 4. I like them to run the table in the Big Ten, but this next week against Ohio State is really going to be the deciding factor of whether that happens or not. Now, getting into this top 3, I think this is a pretty even consensus between Texas, Ohio State, and Oregon, depending on where you're from, if you're an SEC homer or not, if you're from Ohio, if you're a West Coast guy. You probably have a different variation of these schools, just depending on what your opinions are. But I have Texas at number 3. They've just been kind of flying under the radar since the Georgia game. They've won out since playing Georgia. Now, have they looked fantastic? No. I think this Quinn Ewers injury is really something that's been nagging at him more than people expect. He just hasn't really looked the same since he came back from that. I believe it was his shoulder. And so I think Texas definitely has the best chance out of anyone to win the SEC. They've been the most consistent. I do have some questions why their offense hasn't been as explosive as it was earlier in the season. However, I think Sark is going to get these guys under control. When it comes time to play a big game, we can expect Quinn Ewers and Isaiah Bond, and especially this Texas front 7 on defense, to play a clean game and get the dub. And so right now I have Texas at 3. They had an ugly win against Arkansas last Saturday, but I'm not really too worried about that. So give me the Horns at number 3. Number 2, I have Ohio State. I think that Ohio State's probably the second best team in the country. You can make an argument that they're the best team in the country, but that's a pretty tough argument considering the fact that they do have that loss to Oregon. In my case, or I guess in my prediction, I think we're going to see these two teams play again. But really, Ohio State, they've looked great all year. They have the one loss to Oregon a couple weeks back in Eugene. Besides that, I think they've been great. Will Howard has been nothing short of fantastic for the Buckeyes. I don't think he necessarily is an elevator, but I definitely think he's an upgrade from Kyle McCord, who we saw start for the Buckeyes last year. And then on top of that, they've just looked smooth. This running game is going to be dangerous, and I think this is the best Ohio State defense that we've seen in years. So give me the Buckeyes at 2. And then number 1, I do have Oregon. As you can see on my hat, big Huskies fan. I'm going to be there in Eugene in a couple weeks. But, I mean, when you look at Oregon, it's pretty self-explanatory. They're undefeated. They beat who I think is the number 2 team in the country. They've done what they're supposed to. Now, when you look at their game on Saturday, I want to talk about this a little bit. They didn't look great on the road at Camp Randall. And a couple weeks ago, we talked about this with Hunter and just, how dangerous this Wisconsin team can be at home, night game, kind of a weird Wisconsin team there. Defensively, Wisconsin looked great. I thought they put a lot of pressure on Dylan Gabriel to make plays. When it mattered, Gabriel made some of those throws. At times he didn't. But when it mattered most, he was able to march his team down the field and put points on the board. This Oregon running attack, I think, is also pretty dangerous, especially looking at Jordan James and the jump he's made this season, finally getting put into that running back 1 position. I think the Ducks are legit. I do think that they will win out the rest of their schedule. Actually, hold on. Now, at number 1, I have Oregon. I think that's pretty self-explanatory. They beat the number 2 team in the country, or at least who I think is the number 2 team in the country, in Ohio State. They're undefeated. They've taken care of business. They only have one more game, and that's Washington at home. I'm going to be there in Eugene, rooting for the Dogs, as you can see with this hat here. But I want to talk about this game against Wisconsin that Oregon just escaped. Pretty ugly showing for the Ducks. Dan Lanning let his intrusive thoughts get the best of him at the end of that game, trying to run the fake field goal to get the first down. I don't understand why you don't just take the points there. Obviously, it worked out for the Ducks, but if you're playing anyone else besides Wisconsin who has a competent quarterback that can not throw the ball right at the defensive lineman and they can march the ball downfield, he could have put his team at risk for a loss against a pretty mediocre team. And so that does concern me about Oregon. I know they've won all their games, but the last couple weeks, whether it's been Wisconsin or Maryland, just kind of sloppy play. They have the bye next week, so I think Dan Lanning is going to get these guys squared up and ready to rock and roll to close out this season. But I just have some questions about why they've been struggling with these lesser teams. I think defensively, when you look at Wisconsin, pretty tough, stout defense there from the Badgers. Luke Fickell had his squad ready to rock and roll. They got up for this game, and really they had more than enough opportunities to put it away, and then obviously at the end of the game go down and at least send it to overtime. They were unable to do that, and so Oregon escapes undefeated. They have the win over Ohio State. Outside of that, They really haven't played anyone. I know they beat Boise by a field goal earlier in the year. And so I think that makes it pretty self-explanatory for why the Ducks are number one in the nation. So that is going to wrap it up for this episode of Chop It Up. I want to thank you guys for listening. Go check us out on all our social media accounts. And just be sure to drop in the comments what you think. What are your predictions in the top 12? Who do you think is going to win each conference? Anything college football, we love to talk about it. So thank you guys for tuning in, and we will catch you on the next one.